Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're watching Greenwave TV, alternative media television. It is, of course, April 25th, 2013, via our live feed, broadcasting around the world. I'm here with Eric Draitser, making his debut appearance. Great to have you back on the program. We were joking. I think maybe we have the NSA playing some funny business with our internet connection today. We've had trouble with our previous Google Hangout. We're having trouble bringing you on board. I was ashamed because I made you such an amazing introduction to our audience.
I didn't even hear it, but I would remind your audience that Google is the product of a partnership between In-Q-Tel and the CIA, so you never know.
But that is true, and they do pretty much have a monopoly. Let me make sure if I got our systems all ready to go here. So, Eric, pleasure to have you on the show. You came highly recommended by AMTV News contributor Topher Morrison. You, of course, are the founder and creator of StopImperialism.com. You're a geopolitical analyst out of NYC, New York City. You're a regular contributor on Russia Today, Counterpunch, Press TV, many other news outlets now, including AMTVmedia.com. I really want to dig into Boston because the narrative has changed so many times. There's so much confusion behind what's actually happened. There's a conspiracy side of it, a lot of unanswered questions, which we've been over in a lot of great detail. But we're getting a lot of propaganda on who these people were. You know, who were these two brothers? Who were the boys? What were their ties to Chechen or potential ties to Chechen terrorism? Could you expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, I think that there's two distinctly different questions that we need to be asking. First of all, one side of that would be, what is the actual connection between these two individuals and some of these various elements in Chechnya and in the Caucasus region more generally? That's, I think, one question. Another question is perhaps the broader geopolitical question, and that is, what is the relationship between those elements in the U.S. ruling establishment and those forces inside of Chechnya and in that region that have been working to destabilize Russia? You know, we should be clear when we're using the word terrorists what we're referring to. If we're talking about Syria, I use the word terrorists. If we're talking about Chechnya, I use the word terrorists. Terrorists not in the the U.S. propaganda sense of the word, but in the most practical sense of the word. Those who use violence and terror as a means of pushing a political agenda. So, for instance, these Tsarnaev brothers, originally when this first came about, the question was, well, are they simply patsies? Are they actually involved in anything? I think that at this point, it's becoming ever more clear that in some way, whether directly or indirectly, they were connected to some elements in that region. I just saw a report from earlier today. It was a Serbian news outlet, English language news outlet, that was quoting Izvestia, the Russian language print publication, which ran a story saying that they have now confirmed through a variety of sources that the older Tsarnaev brother, Tamerlan, was attending a CIA-sponsored seminar in the Republic of Georgia, which of course we all know is one of the favorite weapons of NATO to use against Russia, lest we forget the Georgia-Russia War of 2008. So if we're to believe this report coming out of Izvestia, which I guess we should also say means that it's coming out of the Russian intelligence services. If we're to believe this report, then we do have a tangible link between the older Tsarnaev and some of these elements. And remember that Georgia is a hotbed of Western intelligence operatives, and in particular the CIA, going back easily into the first term of the former Bush administration. So we do have that direct link. Of course, there is, as I mentioned, the geopolitical side of this. I recently wrote an article for Russia Today in which I explain very clearly some of these connections. We should know that the State Department has been funding mouthpieces, propaganda outfits that are used to spread this Islamic jihadi message in the Caucasus. One that I would point people's attention to is the Kavkaz Center, which is Kavkaz Center is the mouthpiece of Doko Umarov. Doko Umarov is known as Russia's bin Laden. Okay, now, this is an outfit that has now been proven by a probe in Finland. Prosecutors proved that the Finnish government, in cooperation with the U.S. State Department, has been funding this outfit. Now, that would raise a very serious question. If we have a tangible link between the Tsarnaev brothers and some of these elements, and we also have a tangible link between the State Department, the U.S. intelligence establishment, and the terror networks in the region, then that would raise very serious questions about whether or not this was truly a terrorist action, whether this was a false flag, or whether it was something else. I think that's still unclear.
So if there was a viable connection, as you just mentioned, would that mean, in your opinion, that there was an authentic connection or FBI involvement with this event as a possible staged terror attack? And what are your thoughts, and what is your gut instinct around what we've seen over the past few days as this story has been unfolding and the narrative has constantly changed? Do you think that this is a legitimate act of terror by people that just have it out for the United States and want to destroy our way of life? Is it potentially motivated by radical Islam? Or could these potentially be government patsies or maybe even double agents, working both sides of the coin here?
Well, I think that the last portion of what you said is really kind of where my thinking lies. The notion that this is, what, and I'm putting, vigorous air quotes around this idea. The notion that these are homegrown terrorists with, attempting to foment this kind of violence for a particular ideology, I think this is complete nonsense. This is the standard narrative that the authorities have tried to use in every instance of terrorism that has been, I think, that at least on a circumstantial level, shown to be either false flag or at least premeditated in some way. If you listen to my program, or see some of my writings, I tend to shy away from making definitive statements because in situations like this, I don't know that we can say anything definitively. I think that what's more important is to take all of the facts and bring them together and to try to piece together a narrative that is probable, that is likely, and that is provable. I try to deal as much as I can in facts, and as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the Tsarnaev brother, well, I shouldn't say fact, the report that the Tsarnaev brother was part of this training operation, I think, is another piece of the puzzle. I would also point people's attention to the American Committee for Peace in the Caucasus, ACPC. I wrote about this actually in August of 2012. People want to remember back to August of 2012. There was a rash of bombings in the Russian Republic of Dagestan. Right, and these bombings, when I wrote about them back in last summer, I said that these were connected to a destabilization effort in that region that was connected to some of these elements. Now that brings us back to the ACPC. The American Committee for Peace in the Caucasus was formerly called the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya. Now think about who you have sitting on this body. You have Richard Pearl, you have Kenneth Edelman, you have Zbigniew Brzezinski, you have the list goes on and on. Some of the most infamous neocons, as well as, people like Brzezinski, who are not neocons, but who are, imperialist Russia haters and have been for their entire professional careers. So the picture, I think, becomes more clear that the ACPC is essentially a lobbying group of powerful people that attempts to lobby in favor of Chechen terror elements against Russia and against the integrity of Russia. Now, this particular group, I think, represents a cross-section of the ruling establishment in the United States and the way in which they use Chechnya as a weapon against Russia. And this Boston incident, I think, brings that into stark relief.
What do you make of, originally they had identified a Saudi national, happened to live at the Revere apartment complex. I always found that interesting, or the Revere condominium. He was later cleared. Then it was reported that he's supposedly being deported. by way of the Obama administration appeared to be some kind of cover-up around that. Again, what has always been incredibly suspicious to me is the constant narrative change. We had Glenn Beck come out last Friday, said he was basically going to drop a bomb, no pun intended, if it wasn't disclosed by the mainstream media or our government here in the States. He provides some corroborating evidence. On Monday, what do you suspect, or what do you think the link is potentially with the Saudi national, if anything at all?
I think it's incredibly difficult to say, and again, we're trying to straddle the line between evidence-based journalism and speculation, and it's always a fine line because in these types of situations, it's really impossible to get the quote-unquote smoking gun. But when I saw that story initially, it reminded me back to September 11th, 2001, and the story of those 3 unknown people that were captured on the George Washington Bridge. And they were taken into custody, and they were questioned, and then someone somewhere made a phone call, and they were released, and we never heard from them again. And again, can we say anything definite about them on 9/11? No, of course we can't. But I think that huge question mark is still sitting there. Who were they? Why were they on the George Washington Bridge? And why did that story drop out of the narrative almost immediately? And I would raise those exact same questions with this Saudi national. I would also raise these questions regarding the news that broke just earlier today that that the person who had initially been named as a possible suspect, well, his body was fished out of a river earlier today. Now, is that coincidence? That's possible. But again, I mean, in these types of situations, I think that raises very serious questions about not only the narrative, but about the scope of this operation. And I say operation because there's no doubt in my mind at this point now that this was an operation. I think the doubt is still about exactly who carried it out and to what degree these various elements were coordinating with each other, whether they were working at cross purposes. I think that is still a little bit unclear. Now, you mentioned the FBI. I went on Russia Today within hours of the whole shootout in Boston last Friday, I guess that was, or a week ago Friday. And what I said there was that the FBI does have a long history of being involved in these type of operations. Remember that Lynn Stewart is sitting in a prison right now as we speak, primarily as a political prisoner because of the information that she revealed in open court related to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the fact that the FBI was directly involved in creating that plot and supplying the materials that were used.
Now, we know that is a fact. That isn't conspiracy theory. That's a declassified report.
It came out in open court and it's not something that can be disputed. It is an established fact. It has been buried in the short historical memory that exists in the United States, but it is a fact. Now, my reason for bringing that up, though, is that with regard to this instance, I'm not so sure whether the FBI was as directly involved as they had been in that operation, whether the FBI was brought in to kind of tie up the loose ends and to solidify the narrative and to tamper with the evidence. That's also possible. Again, I think that in these instances, what our responsibility is to raise the questions rather than to pontificate as if we have all of the answers. But again, what we see is that the mainstream media refuses to ask those questions, and I think that the reason is quite obvious because they take their script from the intelligence agencies and the State Department.
Sure, and I couldn't agree with you more, and I think, our audience it's almost kind of like preaching to the choir, very much on the same page. The problem is, will these questions be answered? And I have a funny feeling they won't be answered. I mean, I see enough probable cause and effect here to warrant a full-blown investigation so that these questions are answered. In your opinion, is it even possible to get answers to these questions that we legitimately have? Something else I wanted to ask you about is the involvement or around Kraft International. You probably saw the photos that were circling around the internet by the internet sleuths, linking or allegedly linking to Chris Kyle's outfit, the late Chris Kyle, who was unfortunately assassinated not too long ago. A lot of people thought he was an American hero. He was a sniper who had written a book. He had donated all of the funds to the survivors' families. Do you think Kraft International had any kind of involvement in this? Or to me, it almost looks like, again, it was made to look, or maybe perhaps staged, that Kraft International was there. Maybe they were hired by the government. Nobody really knows, but it begins to get so cloudy and so murky that I feel that people don't know what to believe anymore. But I strongly feel that that is, in fact, the agenda of the media machine, is to cloud this news to the point where you almost kind of give up on it and don't know who to trust anymore. What is your take on the potential Kraft International involvement in the Boston bombing?
Well, let me just quickly respond to the question of, well, you brought up Chris Kyle, and I don't know exactly what your opinion is of him or anything like that, but I certainly would not use the word hero to describe somebody like that. I think we can only imagine the absolutely dastardly and devious actions that he was involved in. You don't become a special ops sniper to go around handing out daisies and sunflowers. This person was involved in deep, vicious operations that killed innocent people. So I don't want to sugarcoat that, but that's not really the issue at this point. Kraft International, I saw the pictures myself. It seems pretty clear to me that they're at least to some degree involved in whatever happened. Now, whether or not they're operators that were actually carrying out the action, whether they were there for some kind of a drill, whether they were there on some other reason. Again, it's impossible to say. But the fact of the matter is, the evidence is obvious. They were there. And my take on this, and I've spoken to a number of police officers and particularly detectives and investigators. I happen to know veteran, retired investigators from the New York Police Department, and I simply posed a very simple question. If you have an individual or individuals at the scene of a crime before, during, and after, and they have the motive and the opportunity, and you have photographic evidence that they're carrying packages directly identical to the ones that were used, how are they not suspects? How are they not brought in? How are they not putting out, signed statements, interrogated, and so forth? It's impossible to believe that there was such a lack of any police work being done that these people just disappeared. I think what's much more likely is, in fact, someone was brought in, and that was the mystery person who was taken to the courthouse, if you remember, not long after this whole thing happened. I think it was within 24 hours they had somebody in the courthouse. The FBI calls a press conference, and then magically, mysteriously, with a news chopper overhead above the courthouse, a bomb threat is called in, everybody's cleared out, and an unmarked van pulls in and then leaves, and this person disappears. Now, is this somebody who was brought in by real Boston cops who thought this person was involved, and then a phone call was made to tell them to release him? That's pretty plausible to me. I struggle to find any other answer to why it all went down the way that it went down. Furthermore, I've also heard the theory posed that these Kraft International guys were there to take part in some kind of a drill. Well, again, I don't know that I've seen any evidence of that. I also have heard the theory that they were there because there was legitimate information that there was a bomb threat being called on the marathon. But again, anybody who knows anything about the way that law enforcement works, it wouldn't be a private mercenary company brought in for a situation like that. It would be Boston Counter-Terror Force. I mean, that's what it would be.
Sure, and why would you be stupid enough to wear the Kraft International uniforms?
Exactly.
You would know you'd be caught. So it's really tough for me to buy off on that story. It looks more, or appears more, like it's some kind of staged event. But again, I'm like yourself. I'm not the type of person, to just jump to conclusions. What we want, and what the alternative media, I believe, wants, and what ultimately the public and the victims of the family, the victims themselves, et cetera, deserve, is the truth. And there's been so many conflicting reports. Associated Press confirmed, and they changed the story on this. They changed the narrative, as they did so many times and have done so many times in this case, that there was no gun that the younger brother had no gun when that shootout took place. It was originally reported that he had a 9mm on him by the Boston police. That has since been refuted by officials. Now, you mentioned that it appears that this is some kind of operation. So, somebody was running the show. Someone was running this terror attack, staged or not. What do you think? And I know you're not the type of person that wants to jump to conclusions necessarily, but what would be the reason to run an operation like this? Are you leaning towards legitimate terrorism, or does this look like another FBI government conspiracy? As crazy as that sounds to a lot of people, I was speaking to a report Judge Napolitano had given a while back, where he literally goes through 17 out of 20 specific examples of FBI staged terror attacks. One of them being the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. We had the underwear bomber. The list goes on and on. So what would be the motive, in your opinion, for an operation like this?
Well, before I answer that, because that's a critical question, before I answer that, let me just finish this point about the FBI. The FBI could certainly be involved, and you're absolutely right. Just as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, that the FBI has a long history of being involved in false flag operations and similar type of operations. However, I do believe that these connections that we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation to Chechnya and to some of these terror organizations in the Caucasus region, I think that that's beyond the purview of the FBI. The FBI doesn't really engage in that sort of operation. That's really in the realm of the CIA. You could maybe make the case that DIA could be involved in something like that, but really we're talking CIA. So what is the role of the FBI versus the CIA in this operation? I think that's impossible to say, but I do see their fingerprints on it. The CIA perhaps was running this what should we call? I don't want to use the word cell because that's kind of the way that the mainstream frames it, but that the CIA was using Tsarnaev as an asset and then sending him into the U.S. and fending off the FBI investigations. Remember, the Russians informed the FBI 2 separate occasions in 2011 and 2012 about Tsarnaev, about who he is, about who he's associated with, and somehow magically he's never picked up, he's never investigated. The question would be why? Well, I think the answer is obvious, and it's the same as the question of 9/11, because powerful people made sure that he was protected. So the FBI with Robert Mueller, let's not forget. Does anybody remember? Do you remember, Chris, by the way, when Mueller first took over the FBI?
Yes. So
September 5th, 2001. Okay. This is somebody whose job is to make sure that the loose ends get tied up and that the narrative gets solidified. So I think that it would be reasonable to assert that the FBI was brought in to make sure that the investigation took the direction that they needed it to take and didn't go in the wrong direction, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, which seems to make the most sense to me, as somebody was protecting him. Again, if the FBI had interviewed him in 2001, and this is according to official reports. Of course, we had the mother and the family say that they had been tracked for years, and that the United States had been involved in their affairs. That would either mean, the general Joe Blow public looks at this and goes, okay, well, either the CIA is incredibly incompetent in stopping terror, or there's a reason they didn't stop it, and it seems to lean to the latter. It's just, this is terrible. This is a terrible tragedy, and a lot of people out there, and I'm seeing a lot of this from the leftist mainstream media. Rachel Maddow just ripped into Alex Jones yesterday. There was another Associated Press report that insinuated that Tamerlan, the eldest brother, was very interested in the Inspire Yemeni Al-Qaeda publication, as well as InfoWars, 9/11 Trutherism, as well. So there seems to be tremendous motive to blacklist the alternative media, freedom, patriot movement, and we're clearly seeing this take place within the media itself. This is if this isn't a media war, I don't know what is. What is your take on that? Why do you think they're blacklisting the liberty movement and the alternative media movement itself?
Well, I think it's very simple, and I don't even really buy that it is necessarily ideological. I think it is because they understand that millions of people every day are turning away from the mainstream media, that every single day their credibility becomes less and less, that fewer and fewer people are taking their talking points from the controlled left and the controlled right, that you know, outlets, whether they're, you know, of the liberty, you know, the liberty movement on the right, if you want to call it that, or the, you know, socialists or the radical leftists or whoever, that the so-called the fringes, those that are outside of the accepted discourse, that they are the ones that are gathering steam. And so what you see is a demonization of both. You talk about the, you talk about the blacklisting of, liberty-oriented media. At the same time, we also have vicious attacks and setups against, Occupy members, against people who, don't fit into the traditional controlled media. And I happen to know from personal experience and from speaking to people the way in which this is done. It is the standard setup operation. You're setting people up and they're trying to turn them against each other. And you asked me initially what I thought was maybe one of the major motives. And, I think that there are so many, and this is something that I covered in my podcast this week. Number one, how about the fact that nobody talked about CISPA getting rammed through? That got ripped off the headlines.
Absolutely.
How about the fact that the report came out implicating the Bush and Obama administrations to the highest levels in torture, in sanctioning torture, that is to say, implicating them directly in war crimes and crimes against humanity. That gets ripped off of the headlines. And then I think the most important one of all, everybody saw the pictures and the video from Boston under martial law, and I think that that is probably the most significant of all. I hear a lot of people talking about how this is so scary, how this is so, frightening, and it is, and it should be. And what people should also realize is that this has long since been prepared, and this has been rolled out long ago, particularly in inner city communities of color. I can tell you, I live in Brooklyn. I've worked in inner city schools. The way in which the police patrol those streets, armed and militarized, having quote-unquote no-go zones, stop and frisk, all of these policies, all of these things are now being mainstreamed. That is to say, it is being brought to middle class and suburbia, particularly to, the majority of the country. And that, I think, is a very real outgrowth of all of this. How about the fact that it's now been said and been glorified that Tsarnaev did not get Mirandized, that Tsarnaev has no constitutional protections? How about the fact that he was already being called by Obama himself a terrorist even before he was captured? No trial, no nothing. So what they're doing is using Boston as a way of mainstreaming the tactics that they've long since employed against communities of color, indigenous people, people around the world, certainly the prisoners in Guantanamo. It is mainstreaming all of these practices, and that, I think, is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, and if in fact this was a legitimate act of foreign terrorism, would you call these brothers freedom fighters, or are these terrorists? Because I found it interesting. I read your article, War of Words, the New Chechen Terror, and of course we're seeing a lot of this in Syria right now, where the U.S. federal government arms the insurgency, calls them freedom fighters as they're blowing people up. Well, according to Bashar al-Assad, these aren't freedom fighters; these are terrorists on his soil. And what I'm fearful of, and I think a lot of Americans are watching, even though Boston has provided a very large smokescreen to all this, is, what's happening over in Syria. The last I heard, Bashar al-Assad is on a warship. He's fearing for his life, much like Muammar Gaddafi. Of course, Libya had just been toppled. President Barack Obama bypassed Congress. What is your take on what's happening in Syria, in the Middle East at this given moment in time?
Well, as we're speaking right now on Thursday, what is it, the 25th, we just had the news was breaking earlier today, in fact, that the U.S. government, that is to say the imperialist establishment, that whether they're Democrat, Republican is irrelevant, that they're all up in arms and they're all saying that they have now confirmed the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Of course, what they conveniently leave out is who used the chemical weapons in Syria, because we do have documented evidence of the U.S. NATO-backed terrorists being given training in the use of chemical weapons. That is part of what the operation in Jordan, the training operation in Jordan happening as we speak. That's part of that operation. We also know that this whole chemical weapons threat has been used before. Remember that the U.S. and the Western powers have been saying over and over again that chemical weapons were the red line. That is to say that anything short of the use of chemical weapons will not be enough of a pretext for an intervention. But why now? And I think that is a very interesting question, and I think the most practical answer to that is because the terrorists are being massacred. The Assad government, the Assad forces have made tremendous gains against the terrorists in recent weeks. We've seen them clearing out the city of Homs, which had been a hotbed, a stronghold for these terrorist elements. Remember, when we're talking about the terrorists, they're mostly non-Syrian. Okay, these are foreign infiltrators. If this were 30 years ago, we'd be calling them mujahideen. Okay, this is no different. It is really the exact same principle. When we organized Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen, they were freedom fighters against the Soviet Union. Then they became terrorists against us. We controlled those terrorist networks and used them for political goals. It's the same thing happening in Syria, but we are, I think, right now at a very dangerous crossroads, perhaps the most dangerous in this entire conflict, because I think the Western establishment has come to realize that the Free Syrian Army is a failure, that it will not topple Assad, that no matter how many arms, no matter how much financing they give them, they're not going to achieve the objective. So they move to the next level, and that is using the chemical weapons pretext for some kind of an intervention. What form that intervention takes, I think, is still an open question, but this is very dangerous, and particularly, of course, for the innocent people in Syria who will lose their lives.
Yeah, very dangerous and very serious. Eric, we're running out of time. I want to thank you for coming on the program. And, of course, our audience can find you at stopimperialism.org. Is that where they can download your podcast as well, Eric?
Absolutely. You can find all of my work there. My podcast, Stop Imperialism, is a weekly podcast. I also do regular appearances for Russia Today and Press TV. You can find those in the media gallery on my site. And I also produce a podcast exclusively for BoilingFrogsPost.com with my colleague Sibel Edmonds. You can find that. That's weekly there for subscribers.
All right, Eric. Well, thank you very much for coming on the program. We'll definitely have you back soon. I'm Christopher Green. You've been tuning into AMTV Media, hard-hitting and in your face.